In chapters 1 and 2, we've looked at a variable, we've collected data related to a variable, summarized it in the form of a table or a distribution, and then we've summarized the information in the form of a graph, and then we've looked at some numbers that represent those data. Now in chapters 3 and 4, we're going to study how two variables are related to each other. So let's look at the first question. The question says, how sensitive to changes in water temperature are the coral reefs? Another way to word this would be, does water temperature affect the growth of coral? And the growth of coral is measured by weighing the coral before and after the experiment and keeping the water level controlled at different temperatures. So the whole idea is to see if temperature affects growth. Okay. So here the independent variable is temperature. We're going to keep the aquariums at certain temperatures, and based on that we're going to measure growth of the coral. So the independent variable is temperature, and a response to the temperature would be growth, and that would be the dependent variable. So usually in statistics, the independent variable is called the explanatory variable, and the dependent variable is called the response variable. Now let's look at the second example. We're trying to study if walking speed affects the heart rate. So in response to the walking speed, does the heart rate change? That's another way of wording the same question. So does walking speed cause the heart rate to change? So we're going to independently change walking speed, so that would be our independent variable. And in response to the walking speed, we want to see if the heart rate changes. So y would be the dependent variable. So the explanatory variable is walking speed, and the response variable is heart rate. So that would be the response. In the first two examples that we looked at, it was very clear that there was one variable that was affecting another variable. So there was an explanatory variable, and then there was a response variable, and it was pretty clear which one was which. Now look at the third question. It says, for a class project, you measure the weight in grams and the tail length. So these are the two variables, the weight in grams and the tail length in millimeters, so those are the units, of a group of mice. Now the question here is, what's the explanatory variable and what's the response variable? Here it's not clear why the weight of the mouse should affect the length of the tail. If the weight is high, does it really make the tail length large or small? It's not very clear that there is a fixed explanatory variable and a clear-cut response variable. So in this case, it will not really matter which one is which. So for example, you could take x to be the weight and then y to be the tail length, or the other way around. So you could take y to be the tail length and x to be the weight. It won't really make any difference in this case. Now we know how to read a question and figure out what the explanatory variable is and what the response variable is. And in some cases, you've seen an example where there is no distinction between the explanatory variable and the response variable. So either one could be the explanatory variable, and the other would be the response variable. So we're trying to study the relationship between the two variables. So a graph that shows the relationship between the two variables is called a scatter plot. So a scatter plot, just like the other graphs we've seen, has a horizontal axis and a vertical axis. The explanatory variable goes on the horizontal axis. So x, the explanatory variable, goes on the horizontal axis, and the response variable y goes on the y-axis. And we represent each subject or individual by a point, and you may have seen these kind of graphs in newspaper articles, textbooks, and journal articles, etc. So this is what a scatter plot looks like. Now it's very important to read the question carefully before you do anything else. The problems from your textbook come from various fields of study, and it's important to read the question so we understand the background of that particular problem. So we are looking at this problem, problem 4, and it says one of nature's patterns connects % of adult birds in a colony that return. So that would be returning % of returning adult birds from the previous year, and the other variable is the number of new adults that join the bird colony. So the problem tells us that there is a relationship between the % of adult birds that return from the previous year and the number of new adults that join the colony. So it gives us a sense that the % of adult birds returning from the previous year affects the number of new adults that join the colony. So from the question, by reading it carefully and thinking about it, the % of returning birds is the explanatory variable, and the new adults is the response variable. Scatter plot, the explanatory variable would be the % of birds returning from the previous year, and the number of new adults joining would be on the y-axis. But what we're going to do is use Crunchit to come up with the graph. So we use Crunchit to construct the graph, which is a scatter plot. We go to Crunchit on Launchpad and then either pull up the problem on Practice of Statistics in the Life Sciences, which is our textbook. Then go to Graphics, then go to Scatterplot. In the pop-up window, it's important to select X, which is your explanatory variable, and Y, which is the response variable. And the important thing is to select Show Points. You want only points on your scatter plot. You do not want lines that join the points, because that would not show the pattern correctly. So once you hit calculate, this is the graph that you're going to get on Crunchit. Now let's look at this scatter plot and try to determine the nature of the relationship between % of returning birds and the number of new birds joining the colony. So if you look at the overall pattern, think of what the pattern looks like. If you think about it roughly, although the points are obviously not forming a straight line, the overall pattern looks like a line that is a straight line that is falling. So that gives us the nature of the relationship between the two variables. Now in the example that you see here, the overall pattern is a straight line, but then this is a rising line so that the slope is positive. In this case, we have a falling line, so that would be with slope that is negative. So the way we describe the relationship between these two variables using the pattern that we just recognized is by saying that as the percent of birds returning increases, the number of new birds joining, so the number of new adults joining, decreases, and the increase in one variable results in the decrease in another, and the pattern that it follows is that of a straight line, which means it is linear. So the association here is called a negative association, because as one variable increases, the other variable decreases. So it's a negative linear association, or it's a negative linear relationship between the percent of birds returning from the previous season and the other variable, which is the new birds joining the colony.